Welcome to the Sleepy Scholar, where curious minds drift off to fascinating facts and the world's greatest mysteries. Before you settle in, be sure to like and follow so you can continue to explore the world's most puzzling mysteries and conspiracies on Earth. Tonight, we journey back to a naval shipyard in October 1943, where some say an entire warship and her crew vanished from the physical world itself. This is the Philadelphia experiment. So settle in, relax, and let your curiosity drift into the dark. This is the Sleepy Scholar. The legend holds that in the fall of 1943, the U.S. Navy fitted the destroyer escort USS Eldridge with powerful electromagnetic generators at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, attempting to render the ship invisible to enemy radar as part of a classified initiative sometimes called Project Rainbow. According to the story, the experiment succeeded far beyond anyone's intention. The Eldridge reportedly vanished entirely, becoming invisible not just to instruments but to the naked eye, before teleporting roughly 200 miles south to Norfolk, Virginia, and back again within minutes. Crew members were said to have suffered horrifying consequences, some going permanently insane, others reportedly fused directly into the ship's steel bulkheads, and still others said to have simply vanished from existence entirely, never seen again. If you've caught our earlier episode on the Montauk Project, some of this next stretch will sound familiar. We touched on the basic origin of this story there, since the two legends are directly connected. For anyone joining us for the first time, here's the recap you need before we go deeper than we've gone before. The entire legend traces back to a series of letters sent in 1955 by a man calling himself Carlos Miguel Allende to Morris K. Jessup, an astronomer and UFO researcher, claiming to have personally witnessed the Eldridge's disappearance from the deck of a nearby merchant ship. In 1957, two officers from the Navy's own Office of Naval Research contacted Jessup after receiving a strange package: a copy of his own book, annotated throughout in 3 different colors of handwriting, discussing the Philadelphia experiment in cryptic detail. The owner arranged for a small number of copies of this annotated book to be printed by a private contractor, a version now known among researchers as the Vero edition. Official engagement that gave Allende's otherwise unverifiable letters a lasting, undeserved appearance of legitimacy. Jessup's own story ended in tragedy. By 1959, following a car accident, a failed marriage, and mounting professional despondency, he was found dead in his car of carbon monoxide poisoning, in what medical examiners ruled a suicide, a ruling some have disputed ever since, though no credible evidence of foul play has ever surfaced. That's the foundation. Tonight, we're going to go considerably further than that basic outline, into territory this series hasn't covered before. Every detail of that story traces back to one man, and it's worth spending real time with exactly who he was, because his own biography turns out to be one of the most thoroughly investigated pieces of this entire mystery. Carl Meredith Allen was born May 31st, 1925, in Springdale, Pennsylvania. He served in the Merchant Marine during the war, including a stretch aboard the SS Andrew Furuseth, the same ship from which he would later claim to have personally witnessed the Eldridge's disappearance. In January 1955, using the name Carlos Miguel Allende, he began writing letters to Morris K. Jessup, the astronomer and UFO researcher who had just published the case for the UFO, describing the Eldridge incident in increasingly elaborate detail across roughly 50 letters sent over the following year. The definitive identification of who Allende actually was came in 1980, and the story behind that discovery is almost stranger than the case itself. A writer and UFO researcher named Robert Goerman had spent years investigating the Allende letters for an article. Without realizing that Carl Allen's own family lived just down the street from him in New Kensington, Pennsylvania, his own daughter had been visiting the family's cat for years. When Goerman happened to mention his research to a neighbor, the neighbor, Harry Allen, quietly finished his sentence for him and admitted that Carl was his son. Goerman confirmed the connection conclusively when he matched a specific merchant mariner's certificate number, Z416175, that Allen had referenced in several of his letters to Jessup. Goerman published his findings in Fate magazine in October 1980, under the title alias Carlos Allende, concluding plainly that the entire legend traced back to one deeply imaginative, restless individual. In Goerman's own words, someone who loved to play games with anyone foolish enough to serve as his audience. Allen's life after the letters continued in the same unsettled pattern that had defined it before them. He corresponded with UFO researcher Jacques Vallée between 1967 and 1968, at one point offering to sell his personal, further annotated copy of the Vero edition for $1,950. He resurfaced periodically in different states, Colorado, Mexico, supporting himself through manual labor and a small inheritance, filling private notebooks with dense, cramped writing on physics, gravity, and what he believed were hidden meanings embedded in ordinary newspaper headlines. He died in a nursing home in Greeley, Colorado on March 5, 1994, at the age of 68, outliving Morris Jessup, the man he'd first written to nearly 40 years earlier, by 35 years. The single most damaging piece of evidence against the entire timeline he described is worth stating plainly here, before we go any further tonight. The USS Eldridge wasn't even commissioned until August 27, 1943, and official Navy records place her remaining in New York and Long Island Sound waters through mid-September, undergoing her very first shakedown training cruise near Bermuda through mid-October, meaning that during the exact window Allende described witnessing her disappearance at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, the ship's own documented war diary places her hundreds of miles away, still completing the most basic training. Exercises new destroyer escorts were required to finish before ever being considered ready for wartime service at all. The man who received Allen's letters deserves a fuller accounting than eccentric UFO author, because Morris Ketchum Jessup was, for a significant portion of his life, a genuinely accomplished working scientist, and understanding exactly how far he fell from that career helps explain why he was so ready to take Allen's strange correspondence seriously in the first place. Born March 2, 1900, near Rockville, Indiana, Jessup earned a real Bachelor of Science degree in astronomy from the University of Michigan in 1925, and while working as an observer at the affiliated Lamont Hussey Observatory in Bloemfontein, South Africa, he completed a genuine master's degree the following year. His work there was substantive. Between May 1928 and July 1930, Jessup personally located 854 physical double-star systems, findings that were formally catalogued in the Memoirs of the Royal Astronomical Society of London, a real, lasting scientific contribution still referenced in astronomical records today. He began doctoral work in astrophysics afterward, but abandoned the dissertation in 1931 without completing it, meaning the doctor title occasionally attached to his name later in life was never formally earned, even though colleagues sometimes used it out of respect for his genuine expertise. Jessup's career took him well beyond the observatory. He participated in a U.S. Department of Agriculture expedition studying sources of crude rubber in the headwaters of the Amazon in the 1920s, and took part in real archaeological expeditions to the Yucatan and Peru during the same period, documenting an expedition to Cuzco in 1930. For much of his working life afterward, though, none of this academic and scientific background translated into stable employment. He supported himself primarily as an automobile parts salesman and a photographer, a considerable come-down from double-star cataloging and Amazon rubber surveys, and one that appears to have weighed on him considerably as the years went on. His pivot toward UFOs began with the Case for the UFO in 1955, the same book that drew Allen's original letter, in which Jessup argued that unidentified flying objects represented a serious subject deserving genuine scientific study, and speculated that ancient monuments around the world showed evidence of what he called prehistoric superscience, a claim that would later be echoed, without credit, by Eric von Daniken's considerably more commercially successful Ancient Astronaut Theorizing. More than a decade afterward, Jessup followed with 3 more books through 1957, including one built around the genuinely unusual theory that pygmy races might have colonized the moon before eventually colonizing Earth. None of the follow-up books matched his first book's modest success, and his publisher, Citadel Press, rejected his subsequent manuscripts outright, cutting him off from mainstream publishing entirely. The professional consequences of his UFO writing extended well beyond disappointing book sales. In 1956, Jessup had arranged to join a University of Michigan-affiliated expedition to study meteorite craters in Mexico, hoping to find further evidence supporting his ancient astronaut theories. When the university discovered that Jessup, by then publicly associated with UFO advocacy, was intending to participate, the project was quietly canceled rather than risk the association. A direct, documented instance of his UFO writing actively costing him access to the kind of legitimate scientific fieldwork that had defined the first half of his career. By the end of the decade, with his UFO writing no longer providing a sustainable income and mainstream science increasingly closed off to him, Jessup was reduced to editing a minor astrological periodical simply to make ends meet, developing along the way an increasing personal fascination with psychic phenomena that friends later said reflected genuine, deepening desperation rather than casual intellectual curiosity. It's this specific trajectory, real astronomical credentials, a real and respected scientific contribution early in his career, followed by a decade of increasing professional isolation, rejected manuscripts, and a canceled expedition that had been his last serious tie back to legitimate research, that makes his willingness to take Allen's bizarre letters seriously somewhat more understandable than it might first appear. By January 1955, when the first letter arrived, Jessup was a man whose genuine scientific career had already been effectively over for years, searching for exactly the kind of validation a stranger's claim of secret, world-changing physics might have seemed to offer, however implausible it should have looked to the trained astronomer he had once genuinely been. If sailors really were talking about a ship becoming invisible during World War II, it's worth understanding, in real technical detail, exactly what that word actually meant at the time, because the genuine wartime technology behind it is fascinating enough on its own terms, without needing anything paranormal layered on top of it. The threat began in 1919, when the British Navy developed the first magnetic naval mine, and it grew considerably more dangerous between the wars when German engineers refined the concept, building mines with sensors precise enough to be calibrated in milligauss. Thousandths of a Gauss, the standard unit for measuring magnetic field strength, named for the 18th century mathematician Carl Friedrich Gauss. These mines didn't require direct contact to detonate. Their sensors simply detected the distortion a large steel ship creates in the Earth's own natural magnetic field as it passes overhead, triggering an explosion at the point where that distortion peaked. The threat became urgent on November 23, 1939, when a German aircraft, aiming for water, accidentally dropped one of these mines onto exposed mudflats near Shoeburyness, England, allowing British engineers to recover and disassemble it intact at low tide, finally revealing exactly how the sensor worked. The solution came from a Canadian chemist named Charles Frederick Gedive, serving with the Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve, who realized that running electromagnetic coils through a ship's hull could generate a controlled magnetic field precisely opposite to the ship's own natural magnetic signature, effectively canceling it out and rendering the ship's presence undetectable to a mine's magnetic sensor. Genuinely invisible, in a very specific, technical sense, though only to that one particular kind of instrument, never to human sight. Gedive personally coined the term for this process, borrowing directly from the Gauss unit the German mines were calibrated in, degaussing. Since permanently installing coils in every single vessel proved prohibitively expensive, Gedive also developed a cheaper alternative called wiping, in which a cable carrying a controlled current was dragged directly along a ship's hull and decks, inducing a temporary magnetic bias that would gradually fade and need reapplication every few months. The scale of this real wartime program was genuinely enormous. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, British forces alone had degaussed more than 18,000 vessels. Larger ships required staggering quantities of material. The battleship Vanguard alone required nearly 28 miles of copper wire, weighing 30 tons, wound through its hull. A parallel countermeasure called the double L sweep, also developed under Gedive's direction, used two ships towing electrified cables in careful formation to safely detonate magnetic mines across entire sections of seabed before other vessels ever needed to pass through, clearing roughly 10 acres of dangerous water at a time. Gedive's wartime contributions were significant enough that he was later awarded the Order of the British Empire, and the basic technology he pioneered remained in active use by merchant vessels protecting against leftover wartime mines well into the 1970s. Every element of this real, extensively documented history maps directly onto the vocabulary later used to describe the Philadelphia experiment. Electromagnetic coils wound around a ship's hull, a ship rendered invisible, powerful currents generating controlled magnetic fields. All genuinely true, all genuinely happening at American and British shipyards throughout exactly the period Allende described. What got lost, whether through innocent misunderstanding or deliberate embellishment, somewhere between 1943 and Allende's 1955 letters, was the crucial distinction between a ship becoming invisible to one very specific category of magnetic sensor, and a ship becoming invisible to the human eye or physically vanishing from space entirely. It's precisely the kind of technical detail an ordinary sailor overhearing dockside conversation about classified degaussing work might reasonably have gotten confused about, and precisely the kind of confusion capable of growing, retold over a decade of increasingly distant memory, into something considerably stranger than copper wire and careful electromagnetic engineering. William Leonard Moore, born October 31, 1943, deserves a fuller introduction here than simply Berlitz's co-author, because his own career path reveals how thoroughly amateur enthusiasm could transform into professional UFO research during this specific era. Moore developed an interest in UFOs as a teenager, graduated from Thiel College in Greenville, Pennsylvania, in 1965 and spent years afterward teaching language and humanities at various high schools. An entirely conventional career, right up until he became Arizona's state section director for the Mutual UFO Network and made the deliberate decision to leave teaching behind entirely in favor of full-time freelance UFO research and writing. His partnership with Charles Berlitz began with 1979's The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility, and it's worth knowing directly how that book was actually received by the wider UFO research community at the time, because the reception wasn't nearly as uniformly credulous as the book's commercial success might suggest. Author Barna William Donovan, writing an academic study of conspiracy-themed media years later, described the book as being largely dismissed, even by committed conspiracy researchers and paranormal enthusiasts themselves, as nothing more than a shoddy, uncritical repackaging of an already unsubstantiated urban legend. A pointed criticism suggesting that even within a genre generally open to extraordinary claims, Moore and Berlitz's specific treatment of the Allende letters was considered thin on genuine investigative rigor. That criticism didn't slow Moore's career in the slightest. The following year, in 1980, he partnered with Berlitz again for the Roswell Incident, a book that did more than perhaps any other single publication to relaunch the 1947 Roswell case as a modern conspiracy phenomenon, arguing that an extraterrestrial craft had been observing American nuclear weapons activity when a lightning strike brought it down, and that the U.S. government subsequently orchestrated a deliberate cover-up. Moore's research process for this book, working alongside nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman, was more methodologically serious than his earlier Philadelphia experiment work. The two men spent years personally interviewing witnesses, including rancher William Brazel's family and former military personnel connected to the original 1947 recovery, ultimately compiling more than a dozen sworn affidavits by the time the book was published, directly challenging the official weather balloon explanation that had stood largely unquestioned for over 3 decades. Moore's career reached its most consequential and most damaging turn in 1984, when he and film producer Jamie Shandera received a roll of anonymously mailed film containing documents alleging the existence of Majestic 12, a secret committee supposedly formed to manage recovered extraterrestrial technology. Moore helped publicize these documents extensively, and in 1990 co-published a full analytical defense of their authenticity with Shandera, despite mounting forensic evidence, including the pasted Truman signature, an anachronistic typewriter Fawn examined elsewhere in this series, indicating the documents were fabricated. It was at a 1989 Mutual UFO Network conference in Las Vegas that Moore made the admission that would permanently reshape how the UFO research community understood his entire career. That he had for years been actively working with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations and, by his own account, the CIA, running what he described as a deliberate disinformation campaign against fellow researcher Paul Benowitz. Taken as a whole, Moore's career traces a genuinely unusual arc. A small-town Pennsylvania teacher, drawn by lifelong personal fascination into full-time UFO research, who went on to co-author the founding modern texts of 2 of the 20th century's most enduring paranormal conspiracy theories, conducted genuinely more rigorous witness-based investigative work on a third, and ultimately admitted to having spent years working as a paid intelligence asset, specifically manipulating the same research community that had made him famous. A single career that touches nearly every major thread this series has spent its Dulce Base, Montauk Project, and now Philadelphia Experiment episodes carefully unwinding. Carl Allen's letters to Jessup rested their entire scientific foundation on a specific claim: that Albert Einstein had developed a complete, working unified field theory, that this theory made the Philadelphia experiment's invisibility and teleportation effects genuinely achievable, and that Einstein had personally, secretly taught this finished theory to Allen himself, one of only a handful of people alive who supposedly understood it. It's worth knowing in real detail exactly how thoroughly this claim collides with Einstein's actual, extensively documented scientific record. Not because the record is obscure or hard to find, but because it's some of the most publicly discussed unfinished work of the entire 20th century. Einstein coined the very term unified field theory himself in 1925, describing his ambition to find a single mathematical framework capable of explaining both gravity and electromagnetism as different expressions of the same underlying geometry. Building directly on the success of his general theory of relativity from a decade earlier, which had already shown that gravity itself could be understood as the curvature of spacetime. This pursuit dominated the final 3 decades of Einstein's life, continuing right up until his death in 1955, during which he published more than a dozen serious academic papers on the subject. Working largely in isolation at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, as the wider physics community increasingly turned its attention toward quantum mechanics instead. His colleague and collaborator Leopold Infeld later described Einstein's defining trait during these decades as an extraordinary, almost stubborn tenacity. When one mathematical approach failed, Einstein would simply propose another the following morning, reportedly still working on field equations, even from what would become his deathbed. Here is the part that matters most for tonight's story. Einstein's unified field theory was never completed. It remains, to this day, one of physics' most famous unfinished projects, openly discussed in academic journals, biographies, and popular science writing for the past 70 years. Other serious physicists pursued closely related efforts during the same decades. Hermann Weyl proposed an approach incorporating conformal geometry as early as 1918. Arthur Eddington developed a separate affine geometry approach in the 1920s, and Erwin Schrödinger, the physicist most famous for quantum mechanics, spent much of the 1940s pursuing his own version of the same unification, also without success. None of these efforts, including Einstein's own, ever produced anything remotely resembling a secret, functioning technology capable of rendering a warship invisible or teleporting it across state lines. The entire pursuit remained, and largely remains today, a purely theoretical mathematical problem. One modern physicists sometimes connect to string theory's own, still unresolved attempts at a comparable unification, with no experimentally confirmed success in either direction even now. Allen's specific claim, that Einstein secretly completed this work and suppressed it, sharing it only with a small circle, including a merchant mariner he happened to meet, asks us to believe that one of the most closely watched, most publicly documented scientific careers in modern history somehow concealed its single greatest achievement so completely that not one page of supporting mathematics, not one colleague's corroborating account, and not one piece of institutional record from Princeton has ever surfaced in the 70 years since Einstein's death, despite his actual, incomplete work on precisely this subject being openly published, publicly discussed, and thoroughly documented the entire time. The theory Allen claimed was secretly finished and hidden was, in the historical record everyone can actually check, simply and openly unfinished. One of science's great honest failures, not one of its great hidden successes. No single witness in this entire mythology, offered a more elaborate personal account than a man who first came to public attention in the late 1980s using the name Al Bielek. According to his own repeated testimony, delivered across more than 50 radio appearances and more than 40 conference presentations over the following decades, his real, original identity was Edward A. Cameron, born August 4, 1916, in the New York area, the son of a Navy officer named Alexander Duncan Cameron Sr. His younger brother, born the following year, was Duncan Cameron, the same Duncan Cameron who would later become the central psychic figure of the Montauk Project mythology, examined in an earlier episode of this series. According to Bielek's account, both brothers served aboard the USS Eldridge during the October 1943 Philadelphia experiment, and both leapt overboard together after witnessing the horrifying effects the experiment had on their fellow crew members, including, in some versions of his account, a third brother named Jim who was lost during the incident. Rather than hitting the cold Atlantic water below, Bielek claimed the two brothers instead found themselves falling through clouds, losing consciousness, and eventually waking in a hospital bed suffering ionizing radiation burns. In the year 2137, nearly 2 centuries in the future. According to his testimony, the two spent 6 weeks recovering there before Edward was separately transported, by means he said he never fully understood, to the year 2749, where he claims to have worked for 2 years as a tour guide amid floating anti-gravity cities administered by advanced computer systems, whose human programmers he referred to as windshektors. He then says he traveled back to retrieve his brother, and the two of them journeyed together to 1983, arriving at Camp Hero in Montauk, where they were absorbed into the already ongoing Montauk Project, closing the loop that connects both mythologies directly to each other. Bielek's account continues with claims of having been age-regressed and given an entirely new identity and childhood as Al Bielek, born in 1927, with his original memories as Edward Cameron only resurfacing decades later, in the mid-1980s, specifically after watching the 1984 Philadelphia experiment film. He described his brother Duncan as gradually dying from what he called temporal paradoxes accumulated across their various jumps through time, and said the two of them were eventually instructed to travel back and prevent the original 1943 experiment from ever occurring, in an effort to erase the entire timeline the Montauk Project had grown from. A detailed independent investigation into Bielek's claims, conducted by researchers who compiled and directly compared transcripts from his own interviews across multiple years, including a 1990 MUFON conference speech, a 1992 interview with Connecting Link magazine, and a 1997 appearance at the Global Sciences Congress in Daytona Beach, found significant, documented inconsistencies in his own retelling of his supposed original family history, including conflicting details about his father's identity, his brother's exact birth information, and other basic biographical facts that shifted meaningfully from one telling to the next. The investigators who compiled this comparison titled their published report plainly, Al Bielek Debunked. No U.S. Navy record, birth certificate, or any other independently verifiable document has ever surfaced confirming an Edward A. Cameron matching Bielek's description ever existed at all, let alone served aboard the Eldridge. It's worth sitting with how thoroughly this account absorbs nearly every other thread already examined across this series. Time travel spanning centuries, advanced anti-gravity technology, computer-run future civilizations, age regression, and a direct narrative bridge connecting 3 entirely separate mythologies: the Philadelphia experiment, the Montauk Project, and, through his claimed brief travels to desolate alien worlds, even elements of the broader extraterrestrial contact genre, all folded into the testimony of a single man, delivered entirely without any independent corroboration across a public speaking career that spanned more than 3 decades. The 1984 film adaptation, credited as based directly on Moore and Berlitz's book, has its own genuinely interesting production history worth knowing in detail, particularly because of how it staged its central ship. Principal photography began November 28, 1983, under director Stuart Raffil, with John Carpenter serving as one of the film's producers. Rather than construct an elaborate destroyer set from scratch, the production traveled to Charleston, South Carolina, standing in for wartime Philadelphia, and filmed aboard the actual USS Laffey, a genuine, real World War II-era destroyer, decommissioned in 1975 and permanently preserved as a museum ship at Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum since 1981. A real, historic warship, in other words, was dressed up to portray a different ship's entirely fictional disappearance, docked permanently at the very same kind of naval museum that might otherwise have been telling visitors the accurate, documented history of its own actual wartime service. The film opened August 3, 1984, on a $9 million budget and earned just over $8 million domestically, a modest box office loss on paper, though the studio, New World Pictures, still considered the project successful enough to move forward with producer Douglas Curtis and Joel B. Michaels' next collaboration with John Carpenter, a film called Black Moon Rising, released the following year. Critical reception at the time was mixed, with reviewers generally finding leads Michael Pear and Nancy Allen serviceable but unremarkable, while still praising director Raffil's genuinely striking visual depiction of the temporal displacement itself. Vast, empty stretches of white desert sand bisected by a lone highway and a persistent, ominous tear in the sky. Images some critics compared to the surreal landscapes found in science fiction author J.G. Ballard's writing. The story continued well beyond its initial theatrical run. A sequel, Philadelphia Experiment 2, arrived in 1993 with an entirely new cast, taking the premise in an unexpected direction. Rather than simply continuing the original time travel romance, the sequel built its plot around preventing an alternate timeline in which Nazi Germany had won the Second World War, folding in an entirely separate thread of what-if alternate history fiction on top of the original invisibility legend. Nearly 2 decades later, in July 2012, the story was remade once more as a television movie for the Sci-Fi Network, directed by Paul Ziller and featuring Malcolm McDowell, with Michael Pear returning to the franchise, though this time in a different, supporting role rather than reprising his original leading part. It's worth pausing on what this pattern of continuous adaptation actually represents. A story that began as a series of strange, error-riddled letters from a struggling merchant mariner to a financially desperate former astronomer in 1955 had, by 2012, been reworked across a best-selling book, a major studio film with a real historic warship standing in for its central vessel, a direct-to-video sequel reimagining World War II's outcome, and a basic cable television remake. Each new version reaching an audience with less and less awareness of, or interest in, the specific, unverifiable letters the entire legend actually traces back to. It's worth knowing exactly when the United States actually did develop functional, genuinely near-invisible-to-radar military technology, because the real timeline reveals just how far ahead of actual science the 1943 legend was claiming to be. Genuine radar-evading stealth technology didn't arrive until more than 3 decades after the alleged Philadelphia experiment, and its theoretical foundation came from an unexpected source. A Soviet physicist named Pyotr Ufimtsev, whose mathematical work on how electromagnetic waves reflect and scatter off complex surfaces was published openly in a Soviet scientific journal in 1962. American engineers, discovering the paper years later, realized his equations could be used to precisely calculate and minimize an aircraft's radar signature. A genuinely remarkable irony, given that the theoretical breakthrough behind America's most closely guarded stealth programs had been sitting in an openly published foreign academic journal the entire time, simply unnoticed by anyone who understood its military implications. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, launched a serious feasibility study in 1975, and Lockheed's famous Skunk Works division, the same team responsible for the U-2 and State Route 71 spy planes examined elsewhere in this series, won the resulting contract to build a demonstrator aircraft under the program name Have Blue. Engineers used Ufimtsev's mathematics to design an aircraft covered in flat, angular, faceted surfaces, deliberately abandoning the smooth, aerodynamically ideal curves conventional aircraft designers preferred, since flat panels set at carefully calculated angles could scatter incoming radar waves away from their source instead of reflecting them straight back. At the cost of making the resulting aircraft so aerodynamically unstable, it required an early computerized fly-by-wire control system, just to remain airborne at all. Engineers reportedly nicknamed the strange-looking prototype the Hopeless Diamond. Doubtful it would even fly, before it went on to prove considerably more capable than its own designers initially expected. This work led directly to the F-117 Nighthawk, whose first prototype flew in 1981, entered active Air Force service in 1983, and remained entirely classified and unacknowledged by the government until its public unveiling in 1988, meaning this genuinely revolutionary, genuinely operational radar-evading aircraft flew real missions in complete secrecy for roughly 5 years before the public even knew it existed. The aircraft achieved its radar evasion through a combination of that angular, faceted shaping, an external coating of radar-absorbent material, internally housed weapons bays to avoid reflective external hardpoints, and a deliberate decision to omit onboard radar entirely, since even a stealth aircraft's own radar emissions could betray its position to anyone listening for them. It's worth being precise about what stealth actually achieves. Even now, these aircraft were never literally invisible in any absolute sense. They simply presented a radar signature so dramatically reduced, by some estimates, roughly 1,000 times smaller than a conventional aircraft's, that detecting them reliably became extraordinarily difficult, rather than genuinely impossible. Laid directly against the Philadelphia experiment's claims, the actual history is almost the opposite story in every respect. Genuine radar-evading technology required a foreign mathematician's openly published equations, more than a decade of dedicated aerospace engineering, purpose-built unstable aircraft requiring entirely new flight control systems, and years of secrecy before public acknowledgement, arriving at the very earliest in the early 1980s. Nothing resembling it existed in 1943, when radar itself was still a relatively new wartime technology, when the mathematics underlying Real stealth design hadn't even been theorized yet, and when the very best the Navy could actually offer any ship in Philadelphia Harbor was a coil of copper wire wrapped around its hull to fool a very specific kind of magnetic mine sensor. The Eldridge's story didn't emerge into a culture with no prior framework for a vanishing ship. Sailors had already been telling almost exactly this kind of story for well over 3 centuries, And it's worth spending time with that older tradition, because it reveals just how deeply this particular fear runs through maritime culture generally. The legend of the Flying Dutchman traces back to Dutch seafaring communities of the 17th century, during the height of the Netherlands' maritime trading power, with the earliest known written account appearing in 1790, in a travelogue by a Scottish adventurer named John MacDonald. The core story describes a Dutch sea captain, most commonly named Hendrik van der Decken, who defiantly attempted to round the treacherous Cape of Good Hope during a violent storm rather than turn back, and was cursed as a result. Condemned to sail the seas eternally with his ship and crew, unable ever to make port again, appearing to other vessels only as an omen of impending disaster before vanishing as suddenly as it arrived. Some versions of the legend trace the story to a real 17th-century Dutch East India Company captain named Bernard Fock, renowned for sailing between Europe and Asia at remarkable speed for the era, nicknamed the Flying Dutchman, for how quickly he seemed to move across open water, before one of his voyages ended in genuine, unexplained disaster. What makes this older legend particularly relevant to tonight's story is how consistently it was reported by credible, professional witnesses over the following centuries. Not isolated cranks, but working naval crews reporting what they'd seen through official channels. On January 26, 1923, two members of the British Royal Navy formally reported a sighting to the Society for Psychical Research. Crowds of ordinary onlookers on shore reported witnessing the phantom ship directly in 1939 and again in 1941 at Glencairn Beach near Cape Town, South Africa, describing the vessel sailing under full canvas directly toward the rocky shoreline before disappearing entirely, in full view of numerous witnesses, moments before what should have been a catastrophic collision. And in one of the legend's most striking final documented sightings, a German U-boat crew, serving under the command of Admiral Karl Donitz during the Second World War, reported encountering the Flying Dutchman while sailing east of the Suez. Meaning this centuries-old ghost ship legend was still actively being reported by trained military crews during the exact same global conflict that would, just a few years later, produce the Philadelphia experiment's own vanishing ship story. Modern science offers a genuinely satisfying, well-understood explanation for a meaningful share of these sightings. A mirage phenomenon related to unusual atmospheric refraction over open water, in which light bends as it passes through layers of air at sharply different temperatures, projecting the distorted, apparently floating image of a real, distant ship, sometimes one already sunk, or one simply far below the visible horizon under ordinary conditions, onto the sky or water where no ship should actually be visible at all. The same broader category of atmospheric mirage responsible for the famous Fata Morgana effect, observed for centuries in places like the Strait of Messina, can make a distant vessel appear to float, stretch, invert, or vanish entirely within moments, exactly matching the pattern described in report after report of the Flying Dutchman across 300 years. Placed alongside this much older tradition, the Philadelphia experiment starts to look less like an isolated 20th century anomaly and more like the latest entry in a genre humanity has been telling itself, in one form or another, for as long as sailors have been going to sea and occasionally not coming back. A story that answers the same old, deeply human question every culture with a coastline has needed some kind of answer for. Where does a ship actually go when it simply isn't there anymore? Two additional pieces of evidence deserve attention here, because together they undermine Allende's account even more thoroughly than the Eldridge's own contradicted timeline alone. The first involves the very ship Allende claimed to be standing on when he witnessed the disappearance. He said he watched the entire event unfold from the deck of the SS Eldridge, a nearby merchant vessel, and even named specific crewmates who had supposedly served alongside him at the time, offering their names as the closest thing to corroborating evidence he ever provided. When journalists and researchers later went looking for the Furisetha's actual, documented position on the date in question, they found she was recorded sailing in an entirely different ocean altogether, nowhere near the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard at all. Meaning not only was the Eldridge's own war diary in the wrong place for Allende's story, but so, according to available shipping records, was the very vessel he claimed to be standing on while he watched it happen. The second detail is worth sitting with simply because of what it reveals about Allende's own apparent uncertainty regarding his own account. In one of his later letters to Jessup, sent toward the end of May 1955, Allende made a striking request. He asked that he and any other supposed witnesses be placed under hypnosis, or even administered what he called truth serum, specifically so they might more fully and accurately recall exactly what they had seen. It's a genuinely revealing detail. A man asking to have his own memory chemically or hypnotically unlocked isn't typically a man expressing full confidence in the clarity of what he's already reported. Jessup, for his part, grew increasingly frustrated by Allende's consistent inability to produce any form of physical evidence, corroborating witness, or verifiable documentation to support any of his claims, and had reportedly reached the point of dismissing the entire correspondence as an odd, unproductive curiosity before the Office of Naval Research's own unexpected involvement reignited his interest the following year. It's worth being direct about how thoroughly this story failed to attract any independent corroboration over the following decades, despite genuine effort by journalists and researchers to find it. No other member of the Eldridge's crew, no other sailor aboard the Andrew Furisetha, and no witness from any nearby vessel or dockside location ever came forward in the 13 years between the alleged 1943 event and Allende's first 1955 letter. A remarkably long silence for an incident supposedly involving dozens of traumatized crew members, some allegedly driven permanently insane, in front of an active naval shipyard full of workers and personnel. The Office of Naval Research itself has stated plainly, in its own published information sheet addressing public inquiries about the case, that it has never conducted any investigation into invisibility technology of any kind, at any point in its history. Taken together, a ship's own war diary placing it hundreds of miles from the alleged event, a second ship's own shipping records placing its supposed eyewitness equally far away, a total absence of any other crew member or dockworker ever corroborating the account across 13 full years of silence, and the original letter writer himself requesting hypnosis to better recall his own story. The case against the Philadelphia experiment having actually occurred as described isn't simply a matter of missing evidence. It's a case where nearly every piece of evidence that can actually be checked directly contradicts the story. The Navy's own official explanation for how this legend began doesn't stop at degaussing. Its published information sheet on the Philadelphia experiment specifically names a second, entirely real and separately documented source it considers at least as likely to have seeded the mythology. And this one involves a ship that genuinely did produce a strange, visible glow, decades removed from the alleged 1943 incident, and years after the war had already ended. The USS Timmerman was a real Gearing-class destroyer, the very last of its class ever built, completed years after the rest of its sister ships had already entered wartime service. Specifically because it was constructed to an unusual experimental electrical design rather than a standard production layout. Commissioned in the early 1950s, The Timmerman was fitted with a high-frequency electrical generating system, running at 1,000 Hz rather than the Navy's standard 400 Hz, in an effort to reduce the weight and bulk of the ship's electrical equipment while powering a larger array of onboard systems. The experiment, from a pure engineering standpoint, proved to be a genuine disappointment. The high-cycle motors and servos required by the new system turned out to be more expensive, less reliable, and prone to breaking down considerably more often than conventional equipment, and the ship reportedly suffered some kind of partial or full electrical failure on a regular basis, with nearly every voyage ending in one system malfunction or another. Here's the detail that matters most for tonight's story. Those regular electrical failures produced a genuinely striking, visible phenomenon. High-voltage lines under the Timmerman's unusual electrical load would periodically develop what witnesses described as a distinctive purplish glow around certain components. A real, physically documented phenomenon called corona discharge, in which a strong electric field ionizes the surrounding air closely enough to produce visible light, the same basic physical process responsible for effects like St. Elmo's fire. The Navy's own information sheet states this plainly. The higher frequency generator aboard the Timmerman produced corona discharges and other well-documented phenomena naturally associated with high-frequency electrical generators of that kind. Genuinely real, genuinely visible, and entirely explicable through ordinary electrical engineering, without a single crew member ever being harmed, disoriented, or, of course, fused into the ship's structure in any way. The Timmerman's brief, troubled service history ended not long after it began. By 1958, the Navy notified Congress it no longer had any operational need for the hull, and the ship was formally stricken from the reserve rolls that April, with her remains towed to Maryland and scrapped the following year. A short, largely forgotten footnote in naval engineering history, remembered today mainly because the ONR itself, decades later, pointed directly back to her glowing, unreliable electrical system as one of the two most plausible real, documented sources behind an entirely different, far more famous legend involving an entirely different ship from an entirely different decade. It's a genuinely fitting closing detail for how thoroughly this whole mythology seems to have assembled itself from scattered, unrelated fragments of real naval history. Degaussing coils from one decade, a failed experimental generator from another, folded together across a decade of second-hand retelling into a single, seamless story about a single afternoon in 1943 that increasingly appears, the more closely any single piece of it gets examined, to have never actually happened at all. Of everyone who has seriously investigated this case, one researcher brought genuinely unusual scientific credentials to the task, and it's worth understanding both his background and his specific conclusions in detail, because his work represents one of the most methodologically careful examinations this entire legend has ever received. Jacques-Fabrice Vallée, born in France in 1939, began his career as a professional astronomer at the Paris Observatory, and in 1963 co-developed the first computerized map of Mars for NASA. He went on to work directly on the ARPANET, the direct technical precursor to the modern Internet, serving as a staff engineer at SRI International under computing pioneer Douglas Engelbart, and later became a successful venture capitalist, a career path that makes him, by a wide margin, one of the more scientifically and technically accomplished figures to ever seriously investigate a paranormal claim. In 1994, Vallée published a formal academic paper titled Anatomy of a Hoax, the Philadelphia Experiment 50 Years Later, in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, a peer-reviewed publication dedicated to examining unconventional and controversial claims through rigorous scientific method. Vallée's research was notably thorough. After writing an earlier piece on the subject, he specifically invited readers with any additional first-hand information to contact him directly, gathering testimony and documentation well beyond what Moore and Berlitz had originally compiled for their 1979 book. Vallée's central conclusion offers a genuinely useful framework for understanding not just this specific legend, but the entire genre this series has spent months examining. He theorized that a hoax's long-term survival depends less on the strength of its actual evidence than on the power of its central imagery. The same principle, he argued, behind other famously enduring hoaxes like the so-called surgeon's photograph of the Loch Ness Monster, later confirmed to be a staged fake, and the Cottingley Fairies photographs from early 20th century England, eventually admitted by their own creators to be cardboard cutouts photographed by two young girls. In each case, Vallée observed a single, vivid, easily visualized image: a serpentine neck rising from dark water, delicate fairies dancing at the edge of a garden, or in this case, a warship vanishing in a green mist with sailors fused into its steel hull, proved considerably more durable in the public imagination than any amount of careful, dry, evidentiary correction ever managed to be. He identified a second contributing factor worth taking seriously: genuine, well-documented historical mistrust of military and government secrecy, built on real, admitted cases of unethical experimentation on soldiers and civilians alike. Precisely the same body of real history, including programs like MKUltra, examined in this series' Montauk Project episode. A story about the government secretly harming its own sailors doesn't require much convincing to sound plausible, Vallée noted, specifically because the government genuinely has done exactly that kind of thing before, just never in the specific way this particular legend describes. Vallée's broader career took an interesting turn in the years that followed, as he moved away from treating individual sighting reports as simple physical events to be verified or debunked, and increasingly toward studying the psychological and cultural patterns surrounding how such reports form, spread, and reshape the people who experience and retell them. An approach some later commentators have described as treating the entire phenomenon less as a question of what happened, and more as a question of how human perception and memory themselves behave under the pressure of the genuinely unexplained. Whatever one makes of his broader, more speculative later work, his specific, peer-reviewed 1994 analysis of the Philadelphia experiment remains one of the most careful, well-documented examinations this legend has ever received. A conclusion arrived at not by a casual skeptic dismissing the story out of hand, but by a trained scientist who spent real, sustained effort trying to find out whether there was anything to it at all. Later versions of this mythology didn't stop at Einstein alone. Some retellings claim that Nikola Tesla was personally involved in the underlying research as early as 1931, and that the work was transferred to Princeton University in 1939, where Einstein and others are said to have joined him. According to this version of the story, Tesla eventually withdrew from the project entirely, motivated by a growing moral unease about where the research might lead, and was replaced by mathematician and physicist John von Neumann, who supposedly harbored none of Tesla's reservations. Some tellings add a darkly poetic detail to close the loop. Tesla is said to have died alone and in poverty in a New York hotel room in January 1943, mere months before the experiment he had once helped begin was allegedly carried out without him. It's worth being direct about how this claim holds up against the same real historical record examined in this series' Montauk Project episode. Tesla's actual death, in January 1943, is genuinely documented. He did die largely alone at the New Yorker hotel, and the U.S. government's Office of Alien Property Custodian did seize his papers shortly afterward, exactly as covered previously. What isn't documented anywhere is any credible connection between Tesla and a Princeton-based Navy invisibility project, any record of von Neumann taking over such a project, or any account from von Neumann's own extensively documented career. One of the most well-recorded in 20th century mathematics and physics, mentioning any involvement whatsoever in anything resembling the Philadelphia experiment. Von Neumann's real, verified wartime work centered on ballistics research and later, the Manhattan Project's implosion lens design. Nothing in his genuine service record connects him to Philadelphia, invisibility, or teleportation in any capacity. This particular embellishment illustrates something worth carrying forward from tonight's entire investigation. Legends like this one tend to recruit real, famous scientific names specifically because those names lend an air of borrowed credibility that the actual unverifiable core story could never generate on its own. Tesla's real, unresolved mysteries, his seized papers, his declining final years, and Einstein's real, genuinely unfinished unified field theory research both offered exactly the kind of genuine ambiguity a storyteller could plausibly build upon. Von Neumann's inclusion required rather less ambiguity to exploit. His career is remarkably well documented, and his supposed involvement here appears to rest on nothing more than his general reputation as one of the era's most brilliant and versatile minds, making him a convenient name to attach to any sufficiently dramatic secret project, regardless of whether he had any actual connection to it at all. The Philadelphia experiment is frequently referred to by an alternate name, Project Rainbow, and untangling exactly where that name actually came from reveals one of the more genuinely surprising layers of confusion in this entire mythology. Because it turns out there were three completely separate things called Rainbow, from three different decades, none of which had anything to do with each other. The first, and the one the Navy's own official historical office points to directly, is the real Rainbow war plans of the early 1940s. A series of contingency strategies, numbered 1 through 5, developed by American military planners to address a potential simultaneous war against the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis. Rainbow 5 was, in fact, the specific plan the United States was actively operating under on December 7, 1941, the day Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The Navy's own information sheet states plainly that a comprehensive search of its archives has failed to locate any record of a Project Rainbow connected to teleportation or making a ship disappear. Only this entirely unrelated set of wartime strategic plans, sharing nothing with the invisibility legend beyond a single borrowed code word. The second Rainbow belongs to an entirely different era and an entirely different, but genuinely real secret program. Beginning in the 1950s, the CIA ran an actual declassified initiative called Project Rainbow, aimed specifically at reducing the radar cross-section of the Lockheed U-2 spy plane, the same aircraft and the same broader Cold War aerial reconnaissance effort, examined at length in this series' Area 51 episode. Despite considerable technical effort, the Soviets continued successfully tracking U-2 overflights regardless, and the program's own declassified records, including a January 1958 document, do confirm it involved genuine research into electromagnetic radiation as it related to radar detection, real science, real secrecy, and a real Rainbow codename, sitting more than a decade after the Eldridge was even commissioned. Researcher Andrew Hoheimer, examining exactly how this name attached itself to the 1943 legend, traced its earliest documented appearance to an interview conducted with William Moore, in which an unidentified source suggested the codename might have been Rainbow. According to Hoheimer's account, Moore subsequently found a genuine listing for a program by that name, almost certainly the real 1950s CIA radar reduction project, and treated the discovery as though it confirmed the connection, effectively grafting a real but entirely unrelated later program's name onto an already unverified earlier legend, simply because both involved the general subject of radar and invisibility. Some later retellings of the mythology have gone further still, introducing an entirely uncorroborated scientist figure named Dr. Franklin Reno, said to have led the alleged 1943 project using Einstein's supposed unified field theory. A character who appears in later popularizations of the story, including recent writing by author David Hatcher Childress, but who has no documented existence in any of Allen's original letters, any Navy record, or any independent historical source whatsoever. It's a clean illustration of exactly the pattern this entire series keeps returning to: a real program's real name, borrowed decades later and grafted onto an unrelated legend, then further embellished with entirely invented named characters, until three genuinely separate pieces of history: a World War II strategic plan, a 1950s CIA radar program, and a wholly fictional 1943 invisibility experiment, all end up answering to the exact same borrowed word. We've spent a long night at this shipyard. Let's gather the full shape of it before we close. We began with Carl Meredith Allen, a real, restless, deeply imaginative man whose entire biography, down to the merchant mariner's certificate number that finally identified him, has been more thoroughly documented than almost any other figure in this genre, thanks to a neighbor who spent years unknowingly investigating the family living down his own street. We spent real time with Morris Jessup, a genuinely accomplished astronomer whose 854 catalog double stars gave way, over a difficult decade, to rejected manuscripts, a canceled expedition, and a tragic, well-documented death. We traced Einstein's real, decades-long, ultimately unfinished pursuit of a unified field theory, and found nothing in the historical record resembling the secret, completed version Allen claimed to have personally learned. We walked through the real science of degaussing in genuine technical detail, and the real separate story of the USS Timmerman's glowing, unreliable high-frequency generator. Two entirely different pieces of authentic naval history, decades apart, that the Navy's own official information sheet points to as the most likely seeds of this entire legend. We untangled the genuinely strange confusion behind the name Project Rainbow itself, a real World War II strategic war plan, a real 1950s CIA radar reduction program for the U-2, and a wholly fictional 1943 experiment, three separate things sharing one borrowed word. We placed the story next to the centuries-older Flying Dutchman tradition, and found the same basic human fear about vanishing ships being told and retold since at least the 17th century, long before anyone had electromagnetic coils or radar to blame. We examined William Moore's own remarkable career, touching nearly every major conspiracy this series has covered, and Al Bielek's genuinely extraordinary, thoroughly self-contradicting testimony, cross-checked and found wanting by researchers who simply compared what he'd said across different decades. We looked honestly at how later retellings recruited Tesla and John von Neumann into the story, borrowing their real fame to lend credibility to a narrative neither man's actual documented life supports in any way. And we ended with Jacques Vallée's careful, peer-reviewed 1994 analysis, a Mars-mapping astronomer and ARPANET engineer, of all people, concluding that this story survives not because of its evidence, but because of the sheer durable power of one image. A warship dissolving into green mist, sailors fused into steel. What emerges isn't really a story about a secret 1943 experiment at all. It's a story about how thoroughly a handful of strange letters from a struggling, imaginative man can, given the right cultural moment and the right co-authors willing to package them well, outlast the very ship, the very scientists, and the very witnesses the story claims to be about, all of whom, when you actually go looking for their real, documented locations that October, turn out to have been somewhere else entirely. There are other fences, other shipyards, other quiet edges of the map, waiting for other nights. We've already walked the coast of the Bermuda Triangle, the wilderness of the Alaska Triangle, the mesa above Dulce, and the radar tower at Montauk earlier in this series. And if you were listening closely tonight, you'll have noticed this particular story's roots reaching directly into all three of the others, the same handful of names and the same handful of letters, appearing again and again across decades of retelling. Somewhere ahead, we'll spend a night with the biggest question of all. Not just one ship or one shipyard, but the far larger question of whether anyone else is out there in the universe at all, and what it would actually take scientifically to ever know for certain. You don't have to remember any of it tonight. That's what tomorrow night is for. This has been the Sleepy Scholar. Sleep well.